pressed it to record. Um, so um, Let me get started. So good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. So welcome and thank you for joining us today for this important session for AI governance hosted by Career Advisory Canada. So my name is Ali. I'm delighted to host you for today's session at Advisory Canada. We are passionate about like helping professionals and students stay ahead of the curve, right? So we have been running this for almost 2 years now, especially uh, focusing on new technologies and stuff like that. We invited guests time to time, and giving you opportunity to basically attend these sessions and ask Q&A sessions. So when it comes to disruptive technologies like artificial intelligence, so that's one of the topic we have chosen for today. So as you see, like AI rapidly transform industries and workplaces, and it's no longer just about innovation, right? It's about responsibility. So AI governance is the framework that helps us ensure AI is used ethically, transparently, and in ways aligned it with the societal and business values. So today's session is basically designed to help you understand principles of AI governance, discuss real-world challenges, explore practical approaches, and building trustworthy AI systems in the organization. So in today's session, we'll be covering AI governance, what it really means, key pillars such as accountability, fairness, transparency, and risk management, real-world examples and best practices, and we'll leave that time for a Q&A session at the end. So you feel free to ask any question, either by tapping in the message in the chat box, or maybe we'll see if you have time. You can just unmute yourself and ask the questions to the guest speakers. Okay. So we are thrilled to be joined with Zahid Agha, who is the guest for today, and who is bringing a lot of invaluable insight from his work on AI policy, education, technology. So we'll introduce him shortly. So this is a safe environment, collaborative space, like where whether you are new to AI, you are well versed, or we encourage your questions, any kind of questions you have, like please participate actively and by raising your hand and asking questions. Okay, let's dive into it. So let's kick off the session. So I'll hand over to our guest, Zahid Agha. I'll let you introduce yourself. Please go ahead. Over to you.
Thanks, Ali. Thanks for the kind introduction. So, good evening, everyone, and thank you for taking the time. I know a lot of you are probably off work and made the time to make it for this session. Just by way of introduction, I am the senior manager at Scotiabank for the AI and ethics governance. This team is fairly new. It's been around for about 2 years, and the whole field of responsible AI governance. There's a lot of different terms that that are thrown around, but they all sort of mean the same thing, which is ensuring that the AI is used, developed, designed in a more responsible way, because it does have downstream implications given its stochastic nature. And I actually accidentally landed into this field. So my background is mostly from data and analytics. And at the time I started this role, this was something that was fairly new to me. My learning journey for the last 2 years has been a rewarding one. It's a discipline that you can cover within this hour. So a lot of the material that I'm going to be sharing is going to be more introductory level. And so I hope you guys get something out of this. So just by way of before we get into the agenda, I just want to throw out a quick disclaimer. Throughout the presentation, you'll see some references to work by other creators, and I just want to call that out because it's important uh, to attribute credit accordingly. And so I've tried my best to include the proper citations where possible. And just by way of introduction, I just want to start to say again and just reiterate that this is more meant to be more of an introductory level, responsible AI, AI governance, AI ethics, whatever you want to call it. It's a very vast field. And so I just want to be mindful that there are folks probably on the call from different professional backgrounds, industries, and line of work. And so this hopefully can be a level field just to make sure that everyone sort of understands, foundationally what the topic is about. And so I'll start off with a brief introduction on the topic of the responsible AI. I'll start with providing some real world examples just to indicate that there are if it's not developed responsibly, that there could be harms introduced, and not just on humans, but environment as well. And so from there, I'll start to dive into some of the core principles. Ali's already mentioned a few at the introduction of the call, like fairness, transparency. But I also want to touch upon the concept of bias because it has more of an attention from an ethical lens and potential bias mitigation approaches that can also be employed. Then I'll touch on some standards and laws because this has been a growing field, and a lot of countries, jurisdictions have started to employ, state-specific, country-specific law. EU AI or European AI Act being one of the first ones to be deployed. Earlier, I think this was about a year or a year and a half ago, but they've started to enforce parts of it, especially with prohibited and high-risk systems earlier this year. And then with Gen AI, this is again, it introduces its own novel challenges. I'm not going to get too much into the detail, but just by nature of LLMs, Gen AI, they're getting more and more pervasive in our organizations, in our enterprises, and I'm sure a lot of you guys are also using this in your day-to-day work. But the point is that a lot of traditional methods in terms of how you mitigate bias do not work with Gen AI, just because of the nature of the technology. And then I'll do a quick recap and share some further resources and learning. Ali, just wanted to check if there are any questions so far, or if I'm okay to
No,
move.
no, nothing. So, guys, feel free to basically. So again, we would like to make this more interactive session. So it's in a kind of a learning environment. And since
Yeah.
Zahid is an industry practitioner, so there are some students also on the call. So please feel free to ask any questions, like from career perspective, like how to get into this career, like if this interests you. That's something we can help you out on that. Okay, please go ahead. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. So AI is rapidly changing our world. We're seeing it impact across industries. They help with making businesses more efficient to driving more incredible advancements in fields of law, medicine, and so while the advancements are significant and incredible, there is also a potential downside, right? So imagine imagine AI systems that make critical decisions about our lives, from hiring to who qualifies for a loan or who is even qualified to receive essential healthcare. And without having proper checks and balances for these algorithms, it can start to perpetuate or even amplify existing societal biases, and that could lead to unfair and discriminatory outcomes. And so that's the core issue here is without proper oversight, it has the potential to erode one of the most important currency, which is in the world of AI ethics, it's trust. It's trust, and it's crucial that we address these challenges head on. And so, in terms of some examples, just going by the same theme, um, I've indicated that this is more of a human cost for AI errors, which essentially is synonymous to harms. You've probably come across some of these if you've seen this in the news. So back in 2016, the U.S. Courts introduced something called a compass algorithm, which was later found to be disproportionately flagging Black defendants as high risk compared to white defendants, even when they were used within a more controlling environment. So a lot of the questionnaire embedded racial biases, and that raised concerns, in terms of how fairness was applied in the criminal justice system. This was shut down, shortly after. But there are some other examples like Amazon, which you probably may have heard of back in 2018, where they introduced an AI recruiting tool that was used to screen resumes. And it was found to penalize women because a lot of the data that the algorithm was trained on was on male-dominated resumes. And so the algorithm downgraded terms like, women's names or women's colleges, and that perpetuated gender bias in hiring. From a healthcare perspective, like the Optum healthcare algorithm, so this was more in the US. It was intended to provide uh, or prioritize rather how patient care needs to be served. So basically, they underestimated the needs of Black patients, and the assumption was that it falsely assumed Black patients were healthier, therefore reducing their access to critical care. And it seemed like this issue persisted, even within 2024, and it's an ongoing challenge within the healthcare space, right? Uh, Another example is these two are fairly recent, which is Rite Aids, which is a major it's a major U.S. Retailer, introduced a facial recognition system, and that was used for essentially detecting shoplifting, identifying, it misidentified minority customers because its training data was it lacked diversity, right? So it was amplifying errors for more darker skin, darker tone individuals. And so those are other ways in which biases and discrimination can creep up. It's not really the algorithm, it's more in terms of the data that's fed to the algorithm, right? Those prejudices, those in terms of what you select when you collect the data to train your algorithm is something that happens much earlier on. And so that's where a lot of attention needs to be given. And the last example here is on SafeRent Solutions. So this is a third-party service in the US, which included algorithms to design um, scoring and basically scored rental applicants. And that became a subject to a lawsuit, actually. So there was a $2.2 million legal settlement where the software had to roll back certain parts of its screening products. And so those are just some examples that I wanted to share. Uh, any questions, Ali? Or should I move on?
No, nothing so far.
Okay,
Uh, yeah, I do have some other questions like which I'm keeping it for the end because some of them
sure.
already asked some. So let's continue
Okay,
with the slide. Go ahead.
okay. So we talked about I talked about human arms, but there's also the environmental impact which we can't ignore because again, AI requires a vast amount of energy and resources to power the infrastructure that basically allows AI to make inferences, right? So environmental impacts are usually less reported than algorithmic bias. And specifically large AI models require mass amounts of computational power, and that leads to more electricity consumption, and that leads to more carbon emissions, right? So one of the things that was interesting to me, and I've put in a source here for that article, is this box and whisker plot. It illustrates the model emissions for different types of tasks, and it's measured by grams of CO2 emissions. And it you can see that, if you look at a text classification task, or something that does spam detection or sentiment analysis, it usually has a smaller carbon footprint. But then as you start to look at more complex type of tasks like summarization or image generation, the emission levels increase. So it's a reminder that as you advance AI, it's not just about more computation power or cost, but there's also more environmental impacts. And so what this means from a responsible AI perspective is really scrutinizing what technology you use and whether it's really better suited for the task you're trying to accomplish, right? It's not always about going for the most advanced and latest cutting edge. It's more about fit for purpose. And so the more you work towards more advanced type of tasks like image generation, the more resource intensive it gets. And so this sort of leads us to what responsible AI is, and this is by definition really a set of principles that guide the design, development, deployment, and use of AI that is ethical, transparent, and fair, and also aligns with a widely set of accepted values. It ensures AI benefits to society while minimizing harm, and there's technical, social, and governance aspects to it in terms of why it matters. So I just want to reiterate the same point that it's more about building stakeholder and user trust, right? So it's about building that confidence because without that, you not only run into like ethical risk is one side of it, but then the adoption of AI is also a risk, right? So people they don't trust the technology, even though it's the intent is to help with optimizing things, with advancing tasks. the impact is obviously significant. So not just on individuals, but society in general. And there's also regulatory and legal compliance. So there's a lot of teeth on this now, and there's a lot of table stakes in terms of how many countries and states are starting to deploy laws where organizations are supposed to have governance structures in place, uh, whether they're a deployer of AI or whether they're a developer of AI. And without that, whether you're regulated, especially when you're a regulated industry, like there's real consequences financially and reputationally. And so I talked about the regulation in terms of like what the different types of this EU AI Act. There's a few more which I'll talk about in the following slides. But again, the outcome here or what we're trying to accomplish is that we have to have proper risk mitigation with this. It's more about preventing the bias, taking preventative measures than reacting, right? Because there could be privacy violations, there could be security, uh, you know, uh, issues, and so that can lead to unintended consequences.
Good.
Okay, sorry, was there a question?
Now, so we're just asking, Zahid, so this is more on the commercial side, right? So corporations are basically applying this kind of proactive measure in terms
Yeah.
of applying the compliance. So, um, what preventive measures or something as an end user people you should be doing? Because I know this is more on a corporate structure, but is there some a slide you're going to talk about the security concerns or anyone you should be having, like when you're basically using Copilot or ChatGPT, what kind
Yeah,
of data they are uploading in. So just as any end user.
yeah, I'll briefly touch upon this is closer towards the end of the presentation,
Okay,
but there are components that are applicable to users, to developers, and like different user personas, basically.
got it. Okay.
Okay, so just in terms of core principles, again, there are quite a few principles, but across different industries and organizations, there are a few common themes, and so I've essentially projected that here. So fairness, transparency, accountability, privacy, and safety are the main ones. So from a fairness perspective, this is more about making sure that you know any sort of outputs that are generated by the algorithm or by AI treats individuals and groups fairly and equitably. And this is especially, problematic when you look at automated or autonomous decision systems, right? So whether we talked about Amazon, where the algorithm had projected female candidates because of the training data, which was male dominated, um, but at the end of the day, the algorithm was rejecting those, right? So it was more autonomous in nature, and it was autonomous, but it was also fed on data that was biased. So here the idea is making sure that there's a more balanced data set that's used, and there's some bias mitigation strategies, well, which I'll get to later on in the presentation. Transparency, this is more around, and this is something going back to your point, Ali, on whether there's something for users. So this is something which applies to both users, end users, as well as enterprises. Is understanding whether the tool that they're interacting with is an AI tool, right? So when you look at things like Copilot, ChatGPT, I mean, we know those are AI tools, but then if you're looking at it from an end user and customer perspective that's interacting with, say, a chatbot, or you're interacting with a specific system, if there is embedded AI in it, um, you know, the responsibility here for the enterprise is making sure that there is some level of transparency or disclaimer that they are interacting with an AI. Hiring systems are a good example, right? Like where there can be uh, a pre-screening process where an AI is essentially evaluating your resume or your profile, and so having to disclose to the end user that they're interacting with the AI is important, right? Because they should be able to either um, indicate, there should be an option to indicate that they don't want to have their resume or their applications processed to an AI system, or give that consent. So consent is also very much tied to transparency.
Yeah.
Uh, right. I hope that answered one of your
Yeah,
questions.
yeah, yeah, yeah. This is perfectly fine. So,
Yeah.
so please, again, I'm just asking the audience, like, please feel free to ask any questions on the chat. Like, we'll continue with the presentation. Go ahead.
Yep. Accountability. So this is important because if the AI does make an incorrect decision or doesn't yield the right output, who does the accountability lie with, right? I think this is important because there has to be clear roles and responsibilities. From an enterprise perspective, that is something which, from a governance structure, you have to define. But then, if you're interacting with a large language model which also works with a system, where's the failure point and who's built those specific components of the system, right? So there has to be clear accountability in terms of who owns that. So I put an example like for an autonomous vehicle, like if someone gets into an accident, there has to be a clear chain of responsibility, whether it's the developer or the operator of the car or the regulator, right? So there has to be some responsibility there to determine who's liable. Privacy, I think this is not just specific to ethics or AI ethics. This is something which is paramount even within in the privacy world is ensuring there's consent to use the data. Uh, Data minimization or anonymization are also specific techniques where um, it's more about questioning, right? So when you're collecting data to train a model, it's about questioning whether you really need the data attributes. I've seen cases where in certain projects they just want the whole gamut. There's no sort of rationale behind why certain data points or features are needed to train an AI algorithm. But by exercising, an approach where why that sensitive data is needed, um, this can help with avoiding or preventing bias down the road when you're either developing or training or evaluating a model, right? So that's an important component. Safety, again, so systems have to be robust, reliable. Robustness is important, and just because of the non-deterministic nature of AI, where sometimes you'll see something that you enter into ChatGPT, but then if you enter the same prompt within Claude or a different or Grok or a different large language model, you may not see consistent results. Sometimes when you even put the same prompt within the same LLM, like you tend to see different results, and so robustness becomes a huge challenge, especially when you look at Gen AI or LLM type of tools. And so I want to also talk about biases. So one of because this is an important component of AI ethics. So there's several different types of biases. So within data, as I mentioned, you could have historical biases because, as I mentioned, AI models are trained on data, and so they could reflect past prejudices and social inequities. There could be sampling bias or representation bias, which is when certain groups or features are either overrepresented or underrepresented in the training data compared to the actual distribution in the real world. So I talked about an example before with the facial recognition, right? Where if the system is trained mainly on lighter skinned individuals, then it will perform poorly on individuals with darker skin tones. Uh, Measurement bias is when you're trying to when the method to gather or annotate data systematically favors certain groups over others, right? So if you look at things like sentiment analysis, training data contains that training data can, if that training data contains more positive reviews written by one demographic, then that model might become more biased towards that group's language, for example. Aggregation bias is when you're combining the data in a way that obscures differences between groups, right? So when you're averaging, like say performance metrics, right, across different subgroups, that might hide certain disparities in terms of how the system performs with each group. So those are just some examples of data bias, but then you can have biases within the algorithm itself. And so the confirmation bias is it occurs when the algorithm is designed to favor a pre-existing pattern of data. So your data could already have certain prejudices in it, but then if it could amplify when those patterns start to uh, take higher importance, right? So the model might overemphasize the features that confirm those historical prejudices. And then optimization bias is more for optimizing specific performance metric, but sometimes there's also this balance between whether you want it to be fully optimized, which could mean there could be less transparency in terms of how or explainability in terms of how the algorithm arrived to a specific output, and that will potentially lead to unfair outcomes. And so it could potentially lower the accuracy for, say, a minority group, even though you're optimizing it for accuracy. So predictive policing algorithms. So this is an example for confirmation bias where when crimes are likely to occur based on historical data, and so it reinforces the bias, demonstrating confirmation bias. So I just wanted to throw an example out there if the confirmation bias concept was not very clear. Um, there's biases, human bias as well. So these are assumptions that humans who are involved with, say, the development of the AI system, um, you know, may have some unconscious sort of attitudes or stereotypes, right? So data scientists, for example, could unintentionally introduce implicit biases during the data collection or labeling, or model design and evaluation stages. Experimenters bias. So this one occurs when researchers or developers unintentionally influence certain results of their experiments just to confirm their hypothesis or beliefs. In-group bias is similar to like favoring specific group over others in terms of the data collection. So that way the system leads to perform better for the dominant group. And so we've seen that, for example, with the facial recognition. And outgroup homogeneity bias is there where it's not so much that you're part of the same group or subgroup of people, but it's more around whether your thinking style or your communication style or certain other attributes are similar. And so it could lead to like more poor performance for people who don't have the same sort of conversation style. So for example, if you imagine a customer service chatbot, right, at let's say a telecom company. So it could have a homogeneous team who's working on that specific project or developing that specific project, but this could result in the chatbot trained on a specific communication style, which means it could be ineffective for diverse customer groups like new immigrants or the elderly, right? So this is where homogeneous thinking homogeneously and not having a diverse set of thought that's part of your team dynamics can introduce potential bias.
Yeah. Zahid,
Yeah,
just have a quick question. So, so you basically mentioned about the bias and how the responsible AI works. So, is there a standard framework available where if someone has to develop a LLM, like their own learning models, like so like for example, we have ISMS, ISO 27001, like they have security controls and stuff. So from governance perspective, do we have any specific framework which is
yeah,
more catered towards AI, like how
yeah,
the organization can start working
for sure.
from both sides, right? So because we have different kind of audience, like if someone who wants to get into it, like how they basically start learning from the framework perspective, like they have to basically get the knowledge before they can start working in the industry. And the second is like how the industries can utilize those existing frameworks to make sure like they have put all the preventive measures, right?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. So there are actually quite a few frameworks. So there's the ISO 42001. There's also the NIST, which is National Institute of Standards and Technology, who've done a lot of work on the cybersecurity side, but then they've also in the last year or 2 years, introduced frameworks within the risk management framework for AI. The EU AI Act, which provides specific guidance, a very comprehensive guide in terms of like what is classified as a prohibited system or unacceptable system, a high risk system, a medium system, moderate risk system, and they have specific frameworks in terms of like a different like how do you govern, how do you monitor in terms of best practices, and I think that what can be augmented on top of that there are some libraries like fairness libraries that are also available which you can incorporate within the development lifecycle to implement those, right? So from a tooling standpoint as well, like there is popular tools like Credo AI, which have policy packs based on the different rules and regulations that you can associate to your risk, um, sort of risk assessment phase, right? So if you have a risk assessment questionnaire, which we're scoring on different dimensions like fairness, explainability, or what have you, you could attach policy packs to like whether, let's say, you're deploying or developing the EU, it would start to look at those policy packs and you can ask specific questions or you
Got
can
it.
cater to that.
Mhm.
So these type of approaches can be applied as part of your governance.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
That answered the question. Yeah, thanks.
So just moving along, so interaction bias. So this is again the two key points I want to make, and I think Ali, just to your point earlier on, how do you exercise caution when you're interacting, let's say, with an LLM or ChatGPT? Automation bias, this is the tendency of humans to overly rely and favor suggestions of automated decision systems, right? So
Mm.
uh, there's no sort of natural thought to say, okay, does the output look right? Should I go verify it? Like that sort of that those are one of the key principles which I'll get to later on. But this is something which, as a user, you should always scrutinize, the outputs that are generated because these LLMs can confabulate, they can hallucinate, and so just it's more about validating what you see than just overly relying on the outputs, right?
Yep.
And then
Yep.
feedback loop bias. So this is outputs of an AI system to influence future data collection, right?
Mm.
So it can create that feedback loop, and that will in turn amplify further bias, right? So you can imagine something like a content recommendation system, right? Or by Amazon, which initially shows content, and that could lead to users interacting with that content, and that would reinforce further biases, right? So that's kind of what feedback loop bias indicates here.
Mm.
And then for society bias, this is more broader. So this is more encompassing, like, uh, the larger societal context where, which can manifest in data, algorithms,
Mhm.
human interaction, right? So
Yeah.
I've I keep talking about facial recognition, but that's also something that
Yeah.
is something we should keep in mind.
Yeah.
So I think we've talked a lot about or discussed a lot about like what are the harms, but then I want to also talk about like some possible mitigation strategies, right? So we have to kind of think of it from the lens of um, a factory when like you have data coming in, there's some processing happening with from a development perspective, and then there's an output that's generated, right? So at each of these stages, there's certain things that can be done. So think of like the first stage as the pre-processing stage, which is where your data set comes in, right? So you want to make before you feed it into the model or you start to train it, you want to see there's a lot of feature engineering that AI developers or machine learning developers do, but it's just not about making sure that the data is complete, it's qualitative. It's also making sure that if it's representative, right, based on the use case that you're working on, right? So it's not going to be a one size fit all. You have to really look at the use case. And so that's really about analyzing the data distribution, making sure that no specific subgroup, whether it's defined by race, gender, age, socioeconomic status, or any other sensitive attributes, including proxies, right? So you could even use things like postal code to ascertain whether someone lives or in an area where that represents, people from the protected class, right, or underrepresented class. So that's what the fair representation means. And then you could use reweighting, which is a pretty powerful pre-processing techniques to address imbalances. So in this approach, we assign different weights, for example, to the training examples based on their group membership. So you could give certain groups, more importance, which if they belong to like a disadvantaged or underrepresented group, because that can help with compensating for any sort of disparities in the data. Feature transformation is another sort of technique. So that involves like identifying or modifying certain features that may act like proxies. So I talked about like postal code location. There could even be education, right? Like that may indirectly encode bias related to socioeconomic status. So you can either try to generalize them, or if as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, like trying to minimize whether you really need certain features, and if you don't, then just either you can remove them, right, or replace them with more debiased alternative. That will reduce the risk for the algorithm to pick up and amplify any sort of discriminatory signals during training. And poor quality data, I mean, this is something which, as part of your feature engineering or exploratory data analysis, is something you have to do anyway. But look at things where you're missing values or mislabels or outdated entries specifically for groups that are part of that protected class, because that could lead to unfair outcomes. And then now if you move further into the next stage, which is the in-processing, so this is where the model is starting to be trained. So you start to embed fairness constraints, which is really referring to adjusting how the model learns, um, or treats certain groups fairly from the start. And where we see the model treat certain groups unfairly, then this is something which we see in reinforcement learning, where you're either penalizing the model for giving the wrong output or you're rewarding them. So you could penalize them, right? So this means, this is more on the technical side, but there's a certain loss function that's usually generated, which can be adjusted um, as a penalty, right? So this way, you're reducing the reliance of the model on sensitive attributes like age or race or gender, and then finally during like the training, within training, because it's more of an iterative cycle, um, as you're going through different iteration, the the check to make sure that the model is performing well across all groups has to also be a continuous process, right? So it's not just like you do it once and then you're training a model, and let's say you're adopting a different approach or you're retraining using a different data set. Like it has to be a continuous check as part of your training. And then post-processing is like after the model has made its prediction. So here, instead of retraining the model, you're looking for further opportunities to adjust the model's final output. And that can help with making the results a little bit more fairer, right? So those could be things like adjusting decision thresholds to make sure the outcome is more fair across groups. It could be adjusting, the final scores of the model, just so that there's more equal chances of positive outcomes for different groups who are more disadvantaged. You're auditing for fairness, and that's more about reviewing results, right? So this is more making sure there's human in the loop to make sure that you're reviewing the results, and it's not uh, giving more precedence to a dominant group, right? And fine tuning is also like another strategy where you can start to find the right balance between getting accurate results and sort of being fair to everyone. So there's always this battle between being accuracy and whether the model is explainable, especially for more complex neural net type of machine learning algorithms. So I just want to pause there.
Yeah.
Ali.
So let's see if anyone has any questions. So you guys, either you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, or you can just type your question here in the chat and I can read it for you. Okay. No questions so far. Okay, let's move on to him.
Okay, so this slide, this is just a sort of a repetition of the previous slide, but I've provided some examples for banking, right? So I won't go through all of this, but let's say if you're looking at ensuring fairness representation across groups, right? So this is if you look at a loan application system, then you're including data with a fair mix of applicants from different regions, income levels, and ethnicity. And if you, let's say, look at things like penalizing biased outcomes under the in-processing stage, then that's more like applying penalty if the model's loan approval rates differ a lot across different groups, right? So I thought that maybe mapping a few examples to these different strategies might be helpful. Uh,
Mhm.
um, so I just want to switch gears now on the regulation side. So we're seeing a significant activity globally, like even in the last year and a half or so, I've seen a lot of activity on this front where there's a constant push by various countries and jurisdictions to establish guidelines and frameworks and have organizations who are either developing or deploying AI to have proper governance structures in place. So in the image on the left, this is from IAPP. So this is probably something which you may have asked Ali, or you might ask Lisa,
Yeah.
is that if there's any certain
Hmm.
organizations or associations
Yeah.
that provide more insight around AI governance. So
Yeah.
IAPP, or International Association of Privacy Professionals, is a very like a popular group, which
Yeah.
and I have my AIGP certification from there as well. But they essentially have a visual of specific countries and jurisdictions that are active on AI governance legislation. So
Yeah.
governments and organizations are really taking these concrete measures. And just to reiterate again, the European Union released the EU AI Act, which was the world's first comprehensive regulations on AI.
Yeah.
And that entered into force last year, and they've enforced some of the rules around prohibited and high-risk systems. And majority of the rules will start to apply August of next year. So um, it's very comprehensive, and there's a lot of like teeth and table stakes. And so organizations are starting to sort of start to apply some of these rules, but they have, I guess, especially within the EU, or if you're deploying in the EU, until 2026 to make sure that they comply.
Hmm.
On the US side, like we're seeing um, more state-based type of rules. So New York's, for example, has their I believe they're hiring algorithm law. So I believe it's NYC 142 This is for the bias audit law.
Hmm.
And other countries like Peru, South Korea, Mexico also applying their own AI regulation. So the point is that the dynamic landscape here, it underscores the importance of understanding and navigating AI
Hmm.
governance
Hmm.
and developing and deploying it responsibly, right? So um, I just wanted to highlight that here.
Yeah.
So there's and just in terms of standards, I know I touched upon it briefly before, but again, the ISO 24,000 and sorry, 42,001,
Yeah. So
it
that.
offers like benchmarks for AI risk management, and there's also frameworks like NIST, or
Hmm.
National Institute of Standards and Technology,
Yeah.
and they provide guidelines for organizations who are looking to seek and implement responsible practices. So, for my own experience from a banking perspective, so we are first line, so we do a lot of the risk assessments as a control function,
Hmm.
but we have a corresponding second line as well, right? So they're responsible for making sure um, they they create policies tailored to the bank, right? And those policies, like they're inspired from a lot of the frameworks and guidelines that you see offered by organizations like NIST and ISO, but they're just more tailored to the risk appetite for the organization in terms of uh, what we have a risk appetite for in terms
Hmm.
of handling AI risk.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, sorry. I just want to pause there again. If
Yeah, so we have 15 minutes left. So if you can, let's wrap up in
Okay,
five
yeah,
minutes and we can just leave 10 minutes for the Q&A.
sounds good. Okay, so while there are approaches in terms of how you handle AI responsibly, there's also challenges with that, right? So one of them is technical complexity. So a lot of these mitigation steps that I talk about work well with traditional AI, but large language models, deep neural networks are often opaque. And so it makes it very difficult to ensure fairness, transparency, or safety just by virtue of how easily they're explainable, right? So chatbots usually have complex uh, architecture, and it obscures why it generates bias or harmful responses, right? Then there's also the culture and ethical variations. So ethical norms differ across regions, culture, and communities, right? So because there's no standardization there, there's no sort of universal AI ethics standards, right?
Hmm.
So for example, like an AI designed for content moderation may flag culturally specifically humor, but in one region or one country, but it could be offensive, like let's say in the Western world, right? So
Yeah.
those are not universal. There's also economic constraints, so implementing AI practices like such as bias audits, robust testing, those are good practices, but they require significant resources to do, right? So if you don't have enough funding to have a proper team structure, then it's very difficult to take on these things. Regulatory fragmentation. So there's global regulation, but there's also country and jurisdiction specific regulation. And so there are challenges sometimes for organizations who operate internationally to pick which one should they go with, right? Like it can get overwhelming.
Yeah.
And then there's data limitations as well. So this is not a new problem. Like data quality issues have been there from even before AI was there,
We
but
just, yeah.
it just amplifies it, right? So
Mhm.
um, and so who's really responsible, right? So ensuring safe and ethical use of AI is not a responsibility for a single entity. It's more of a team sport, right? So there's organizations who build, deploy AI. They have to have AI governance programs in place. And so, like I was mentioning earlier, like there's policies, there's principles. You start with that, and then
Mm.
from principles, you start to look at specific practices, right? Because developers don't know what principles mean. Like you're going to
Sure.
talk about fairness, explainability, but you need to tell them practically like what does that mean, right?
Yeah.
So having those specifications is important. Government, again, whether you operate globally in a certain country, there are laws you're subjected to. So for Canada, like for banking, for example, there's the OSFI E23 that's coming up, which requires financial institutions, insurance to maintain an AI inventory system, right? So this is just to make sure that you know what sort of risks you're exposed to. If you don't manage the inventory, then you don't know what's running in your environment.
Right.
Civil society. There's firms or groups like All Tech is Human, and their mandate is to work on tackling like thorny tech and societal issues. So this is also where like just to one of your points earlier, Ali, is that if you want to learn about the field, there are forums like AI Tech is Human where you can go in and start to look at the kind of projects that they're doing just to get more and more familiar with the field of ethics. And then AI ML developer. So this is making sure that when they're developing AI systems, they incorporate the ethics by design principles, right? So again, it has to be prescriptive, but it's a lot of it is change management and literacy, right? Not
Mm.
just AI literacy, but even responsible AI literacy.
Right.
And so there has to be proper framework. So again, as I mentioned, like there has to be documented ethics policies that outlines principles, values, and standards. But then there has to be some specifics around like what they translate to from a practical perspective, um, involving diverse teams. So if so this I think I talked about like how if you have a homogeneous team, then you don't have diversity of thought. And so a lot of the teams they're not just technical, they include ethicists, they have domain experts, a lot of them have community voices, so they bring in people from outside to bring in out external perspectives, just to make sure that systems are, inclusive, they're culturally sensitive, and they address the varied user needs.
Mm.
Conducting risk assessment. So this is more of a systematic way of understanding what your problem spaces, your parameter spaces, when you're evaluating a specific use case, right? So no use case is uniform, but then there's some common themes or principles you can touch on, and certain principles take higher precedence than others, right? If it's an autonomous system versus if you're using AI to just generate content, right, which is internal facing, two different risk levels, right? So just understanding the use case and conducting those risk assessments accordingly is paramount, right? Monitoring is important. So as I mentioned, like AI systems are not deterministic, right? They learn from data. Data can change, right? As you're learning on your test sets, your training sets, but then as you start to see more production data, there could be they could drift your models, right? And so there's a need to making sure that you're monitoring these models because new types of data can bring in not just performance issues, but potential ethical issues as well. And then finally, educating your stakeholders, right? So a lot of like you'll see a lot of organizations struggle with understanding why they even need AI governance. I mean, this was something cybersecurity went through
One of the biggest challenge.
20,
Yeah.
25 years ago, right? They
Yeah.
didn't understand why they need security. And so
Yeah.
having those literacy, like top-down, sort of support, sponsorship from leadership as to
Very
why
important.
they need to have those guardrails is important.
Yeah. That's good. That's great.
Okay. And so for generative AI, like this, I mentioned like it, unlike traditional models, like um, where like if it's a statistical technique used, like Gen AI more open-ended, and so they often lack fixed answers, right? And so because of the vastness of response and the evolving nature of knowledge, because a lot of these large language models are trained, you see like a new version coming in because they're constantly updating their training data. It makes it very difficult to validate against a comprehensive set of guidelines, right? And so because of that bias, from a bias and fairness perspective, this diverse data source can reveal and amplify both obvious and subtle bias. And so it's these are hard to detect. And as these models continue to adapt to new interaction inputs, there's an increased risk for acquiring new biases that may be unforeseen from before. Uh, I talked about computational cost earlier when we talked about the environmental impact, but then there's a higher cost of and time investment in training and validating these models, right? Which could be and that can be a barrier if there's a high cost for evaluating them as well. And so the validation techniques, they have to evolve as well. Traditional frameworks are not gonna cut it, and so there's a lot of literature and research being done in terms of how to do LLM evals. Um, and so for users or for developers, and I think this is something I was telling you earlier, Ali, is like depending on whether a user don't trust the information blindly. Like you have to validate the output to avoid things like automation bias, where you're over relying on the AI, right? So understand that these responses are based on patterns, not personal knowledge of understanding. And educating yourself what Gen AI is good at, like it's really good at generating summaries, but it's weak at factual, like it produces factual inaccuracy. So if you're using it for something which, within the medical field or something that's high risk or high stakes, the level of validation and scrutiny increases, right? Um, and then so you just have to make sure that you always verify this critical information. From a developers and builders perspective, this is also about, potential risk biases. Like you have to start at the beginning of the development process from the data collection stage, making sure that you're also participating in governance because as these emerging techs are coming in, governance structure or governance principles and processes are not static. Like they're going to evolve as well, and which means that when you develop for future systems, your the ethics by design principles are also going to evolve.
Yeah.
And then this, yeah,
Zahid, just wanted to stop you. I just wanted
yeah,
to
sure.
ask you, like, so we have 6 minutes left. I have a
Okay.
few questions here. I want to run it by you if you're
Yeah,
okay
for
with that.
sure. For sure.
So one of the questions came up is because mostly on the career path exploration, right? So, can professionals from non-technical background pursue a career in AI governance, and if so, how? And which roles or job titles are commonly associated with AI governance? Since you are already in the industry. So this is something if you can address or answer this question, like how, because this is more from someone who's already in the mid-career and they want to take this as a career path, or either someone who is basically starting their career coming out of the fresh as a fresh graduate, like how did they get their foot in the door?
Yeah, that's a good question because I think there's so first of all, if I were to look at my own example at the bank, like my team is pretty diverse. Like I come from a quasi-technical background. We have also a machine learning engineer who's part of our team. We have people who are from like humanities or political science backgrounds who bring in their lens as well from an ethics perspective. And so having that diversity of thought within an AI governance team is important. So you don't have to, just to answer your question, you don't have to be technical, but what is important is having a foundational knowledge of how AI works, right?
Mm,
And I think that there are quite a few resources out there where you can, I think Andrew Ning from Coursera, like AI for Everyone is a good starting point if you
yeah.
want to learn about some of the
Mm,
foundational aspects of AI.
okay.
I talked about like communities, research communities like AI Tech is Human. And so just to your point around if someone's new or trying to change careers, it's hard to break into this field. But if you kind of look at some open source type of projects, look at these research groups and see what they're doing, what are some of the complex tech and society issues that they're working with, and just leveling up on that, right? Just learning on that um, is important. So it's a mix of doing some hands-on type of open source projects and also sort of upskilling on the fundamentals of what AI is. There's also courses on responsible AI which you
Hmm.
can take as well. A lot of people I've also seen who've come into AI governance, they come from a data governance background too. But I've also seen like people within the technical field who may be working on data quality type of or data analysts, right? Which because they understand how data works, they have to just kind of augment the whole ethical or governance aspect of it. And so again, just people come from different walks of life. Just to answer your question. Yeah.
Okay. I have another question just came in the chat, so I'm
Yeah.
going to read it. So if I build and train my own model, what do you think would make it stand out, and how should I make it reach to the right audience? So it's not towards governance, but
Yeah.
again, it's more of if someone is trying to uh, get into the market and trying to attract or be more sellable out of the market to get a job opportunity. So I think so that's where the motive is.
Okay, so it's not so much from a governance angle, it's just more in terms of building a
Yeah,
system which has is powered by AI. Is that the
yeah,
idea?
yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, so it's like how to attract people because the thing is probably this is going to be more on a community set. Like if you're aware of any communities like where these models can be presented or share the ideas can be shared and get people
I
attracted to
mean,
that.
a lot of what I see when people start to share these kind of projects are they go to open source communities, they go to like GitHub, like that's where they share a lot of
Okay.
this,
Okay.
and they augment that with like specific blogs or posts that they write on LinkedIn, right? So
Hmm.
um, it's more about providing that context, right? Like people are just not going to go to your GitHub. Like it's more about providing, value. Like how do you communicate your value for
Hmm.
what that system's providing, and
Hmm.
then like GitHubs and like these are open source
Yeah.
type of forums or places you can go.
Yeah, and as per my knowledge, like my experience, like working with the professional, right? So
Yeah,
there seems to be a bit of a gap of understanding. Like if someone is a business user,
yeah,
and the other person is te too
yeah,
techy, trying to
exactly.
basically sell
Yeah,
their models. Like they need to really explain them in a very layman terms, like what is the use
exactly.
case you're trying to sell, right?
Yeah,
What problem you're trying to address in terms of like what that model is trying to address. So.
exactly.
So I think so that is a bit of a key area in terms of like addressing
That's a
these
good
things.
point. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
understanding your customers, who you're solving it for. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. I have one more question. If you're okay with that, I
Sure.
can.
Yeah, for sure.
So this is more about networking and professional development. I think so. We have touched base upon that. So, what professional communities, conferences, or organizations would you recommend students
Yeah,
join, learn, and network at?
yeah, for sure. So here's the thing. There's a lot of AI conferences. So there's AI conference alert.com. Like there's this website where you can see like what are the upcoming conferences coming up by different months. But a lot of these conferences usually talk about AI, and there are specific sessions that are geared towards like responsible AI or safety, those areas. So that could be one forum. I would say also check out like the IAPP. They have something called International Association of Privacy Professional Canada Privacy Symposium.
Hmm.
That is one other conference. There's also IEEE Ethically Aligned which focuses on like ethical standards. Like they have usually talks on that. Montreal Ethics Institute is a pretty popular one. They focus more on like democratizing AI ethics literacy. So those are just some examples that you could leverage.
Yeah. So hey, just one more question came in. Like, what kind of internship opportunities students should be looking for to break into AI governance? Have you seen any internship or co-op coming in specifically in this AI governance area?
I have yeah, I have. I mean, we've had interns ourselves here at the
Okay.
bank, and um it's a bit of a learning curve because a lot of them, so some of them come from different, like they come from either engineering or
Yeah.
business background, and so there's definitely a learning curve there, especially if they haven't taken courses or taken some of the
Okay.
foundational courses,
Yeah.
but some of them they come into like they may come into like risk functions, right? So enterprise risk, operational risk areas, through those, and maybe forge their way towards AI governance. So there's different paths, like depending on where they enter from.
Okay, no, sounds good.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions, team? Like, audience, like we have few people on the call. If you guys want to unmute yourself and ask any question, please feel free to do so. Okay. Is there any other more content here, Zahid? I
No, I
know the
just
time's up, but
these are
I
just
think
the resources I wanted to
yes, yes,
share. I'll share this deck after the call with you, and
sure,
feel free to share it.
sure. Okay. No, this is great. Thank you so much. I think so we can end the call. But thanks everyone for joining this session. I'll be sharing this recording. So if you guys were not able to join from the beginning, so you can basically go and play this video and go through that. It was a lot of informative. So that's I thank you so much. I appreciate for your taking out
You're
time in
welcome.
this evening and sharing your experience and insight about like how to get into governance AI. I know there's a lots going on, and people are trying to learn from industry practitioners like yourself, just to see like how they can bridge the gap and basically be part of it. And of course, this is going to be one of the demanding job roles in the market. So I think so. It's just a moment where how people can basically get themselves involved in this and be part of it, right?
Yeah, 100%. No, thank you again for having me, and thanks everyone for your time and your attention.
Thanks a lot. Have a
Appreciate it.
good one. Take care.
Thank you. Take care.